The 2008 China Quake. Terror off the Richter scale. A deadly force of nature that struck without warning. Now, in the aftermath, a unique opportunity to crack the code of megaquakes. An international team of experts hits ground zero, searching for clues to help save lives in the future whenever killer quakes strike.
I can only compare it to 9/11.
These people were living in a ticking time bomb.
Uncovering the truth about the day the Earth wouldn't stand still. "1,500 kilometers southwest of Beijing, in the heart of Sichuan province, the epicenter of China's monster quake. A year after the disaster, this wild terrain is the scene of intense investigation by a team of scientists. They've come here from around the world to unlock the mysteries of a disaster like no other. May 12, 2008. A magnitude 7.9 earthquake strikes Sichuan, releasing a surge of seismic energy, the equivalent of 3,000 atomic bombs, or 50 million tons of TNT. In 120 unforgiving seconds, the quake leaves a trail of devastation over 100,000 square kilometers, an area the size of South Korea. The disaster ripped through the heart of Sichuan. Over 5 million buildings destroyed, 5 million people homeless. Nearly 90,000 lives lost. As the nation grieved, the whole world asked why. Scientists have come here to find answers. It's a long, treacherous journey into the epicenter. Harder still, searching the rubble for vital clues. Each investigator brings a special set of skills to analyze evidence and decode the disaster. Geology, seismology, engineering.
You can tell with this wall that the earthquake was coming like this, from this direction.
A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to study the effects of a deadly earthquake. And a chance to reveal whether the Sichuan quake was a freak of nature or a disaster waiting to happen.
All of the load is supposed to be resisted by the masonry wall.
Dr. Elizabeth Hausler is an earthquake engineer who's dedicated her life to investigating disaster scenes. But she's never seen anything like this before.
The scale of this disaster is the largest I've ever seen, both in terms of the area that is affected by the earthquake and the number of people that were killed.
The quake zone looks more like a war zone, abandoned by everyone except the scientists.
I'm sitting on a tomb. There are a lot of bodies that haven't been recovered yet, a lot of people still missing.
18,000 people are missing. Their bodies may never be found. Dr. Hausler's mission: find out why so many buildings collapsed.
You can completely see why this is such a vulnerable building type. We're doing a forensic investigation here. There's a lot of clues, both in the rubble and in the buildings that are still standing.
Among the carnage, two different types of buildings: brittle and ductile structures.
Brittle materials have very little ability to absorb seismic energy. They're like glass or this piece of chalk. The minute I start to bend it, it breaks. Unlike other more ductile materials like steel or wood or this incense stick, which can absorb a lot more energy, I can bend it a lot further before it breaks.
Tests show that in an earthquake, strong, flexible, or ductile buildings hold together, giving inhabitants a chance to survive. Unreinforced brittle structures suffer catastrophic failure. The survival rate, tragically low. Dr. Hausler believes brittle construction techniques are responsible for massive loss of life.
It's not the earthquake that kills people, it's the building collapsing. So these people were living in a ticking time bomb.
The evidence is scattered on the ground. Heavy precast concrete floors and unreinforced brick walls.
This combination of a very heavy roof on a very brittle masonry wall was deadly. It's like building a house of cards out of really heavy cards.
And it's how these buildings respond to shaking that's at the heart of why so many people died. When a quake strikes, waves of seismic energy tear through the ground. Primary waves, called P waves, are first to leave the epicenter. P waves are like sound waves. They don't do any damage. It's the secondary waves, or S waves, that start the ground shaking. Side to side, and up and down. When the waves of seismic energy pass through brittle buildings, they leave a seismic signature. X marks the spot.
This is a classic textbook example of what an earthquake can do to an unreinforced masonry building. So we can tell right away that the earthquake strong shaking came from this direction. So as that shear force comes up into the wall, it causes a diagonal crack, a shear failure here. This is why
Without reinforcing, these buildings were ripped apart by seismic energy. The shake wrecked 21 million buildings. Over 5 million collapsed, including over 6,000 schools. Ya Zhiping is the headmaster of a school that felt the full force of the quake.
When I saw that so many schools have been destroyed and so many students have lost their lives, I felt very, very sad. Sorry, lots of my friends died.
Principal Ya and his students are alive thanks to a decision he made 10 years ago. Concerned that his school wouldn't withstand the force of a large earthquake, Ya Zhiping raised $25,000 to strengthen his classrooms.
This pillar wasn't there before.
The retrofit added steel-reinforced pillars, transforming the brittle school into a ductile school. And when the ground started to shake, Ya's students had a chance to escape. Steel is 20 times stronger than brick and 12 times more elastic than concrete. Buildings reinforced with steel are strong, flexible, and ductile enough to absorb waves of seismic energy. But in Sichuan, over 5 million unreinforced buildings and over 6,000 schools claimed thousands of lives. And as other schools collapsed, all of Ya's 2,000 students evacuated and survived. Principal Ya is a hero, The reason why his school still stands is clear. But some surviving structures defy engineering logic. These are the miracles of Sichuan. Brittle buildings that should have collapsed, but somehow withstood the monster quake. It's a mystery that earthquake engineer Professor Sun Baitao hopes to solve. How did these brittle structures resist the shaking while others were obliterated? To find out, Sun first tests the quality of the concrete.
I'm testing the strength of the reinforced concrete. Its weakness is that the aggregate's made from stones that are too large and smooth to bind properly with the concrete. These pillars weren't strong enough for the earthquake.
The weak building material deepens the mystery. This building should have collapsed. It doesn't measure up to the level of local building standards for earthquakes.
The basic seismic design level for this town was level 7. The actual earthquake intensity was far beyond the seismic design level.
Engineers measure an earthquake's destructive power on a scale of 1 to 12, called the Mercalli Intensity Scale. The world's strongest quakes earn a 12. The Sichuan quake peaked at level 11, almost the maximum intensity ever recorded. Somehow, certain brittle buildings withstood one of the most intense earthquakes ever registered. Sun looks closer and discovers a surprising reason why these buildings survived. Buildings with a lot of small apartments withstood the quake better than those with fewer but larger rooms. Sun's expertise tells him structures are only as strong as the load-bearing pillars and beams that support them. Buildings with more apartments packed inside have more pillars and beams, giving the structure extra load-bearing strength, like a honeycomb. Buildings with small rooms withstand seismic energy more than similar buildings with larger rooms. Ironically, people who lived in cramped apartments had a better chance of surviving the Sichuan quake. But one other key factor may have saved lives. These apartments all face the same direction. Buildings facing the fault were more likely to survive than those built at right angles to it. Engineers don't yet fully understand this phenomenon. Some people believe the risk of collapse could increase when a structure's weakest side takes the full impact of the shaking. It's a theory that could rewrite building codes around the world, helping to improve the survival rates of the estimated 200 million people living in the shadow of a fault. Because brittle buildings are not just a problem in China.
There are 500 non-ductile concrete moment-resisting frames in San Francisco Bay Area, and we all know that the Bay Area is overdue for another strong earthquake.
The scientific discoveries made in Sichuan could save other cities from total destruction. But understanding building science is just one part of this mystery. Powerful forces unleashed a catastrophic chain reaction that caused mountaintops to explode and bury whole towns. Ground Zero, Beichuan Town, where Sichuan's magnitude 7.9 quake reached apocalyptic proportions. Nearly half the town's population are dead, mercilessly caught in the crossfire of one of the planet's most deadly natural forces. Engineering geologist Professor Xu Qiang recalls the day Beichuan became a living hell.
The intense shaking threw people half a metre into the air. Nobody could stand up. They were all crawling on the ground. People trapped inside buildings jumped out of windows to escape.
Xu's quest is clear. If the surviving citizens are ever to return home, he needs to figure out how Beichuan turned from resort town to ghost town. Xu knows the disaster started underground. But a second, devastating body blow came from above.
The landslide happened just 10 minutes after the earthquake.
This was no ordinary landslide. It was a rock storm. Mountainsides exploded, hurling boulders the size of trucks over 300 meters through the air, smashing cars, crushing apartment blocks. The first big landslide buried 1,600 people. To find out what triggered the series of lethal landslides, Xu needs to uncover the geological mysteries hidden high above Beichuan. The engineers use a 3D scanner to survey the rockfall. The data reveals just one kind of rock in the landslide, but the mountains above the town contain two different types of rock: shale and limestone. Professor Xu knows only one of these rocks devastated Beichuan.
This shale stone came from the mountains behind the town. It has travelled 2,000 metres. The other side of the mountain is mainly limestone.
To solve the puzzle and understand what caused the crushing landslides, Xu needs to recreate the disaster back in the lab. The engineers make a miniature version of the mountains. The slope on the left is soft shale. On the right, hard limestone. The soft shale fractures under extreme pressure. The hard limestone cracks, but absorbs the seismic energy enough to stay intact. In a shake this big, soft shale literally shatters under pressure, releasing a rain of terror into the valley below. But worse was still to come. Four months after the quake, catastrophe struck again. Heavy rain combined with loose rock triggered another disaster. A seething torrent of mud and stone left Beichuan 3 stories deep in debris. A year after the quake, Sichuan province is still in grave danger from the same calamity that buried the town of Beichuan. Professor Xu is on a mission to defuse a potential disaster so terrifying it could wipe out thousands of lives. Once, this hillside was home to over 1,000 people. Now, it's a graveyard. Hongguang town and its lost inhabitants lie buried under 130 million cubic meters of hard rock. Enough stone to cover Tiananmen Square over 300 times. It's too late to save Hongguang. But what worries Xu is the threat that lies directly under his feet.
The landslide buried 2 rivers, which became 2 barrier lakes.
A geological phenomenon called a quake lake. A growing reservoir of water with nowhere to go. Landslides create quake lakes when hundreds of tons of rock block steep river valleys. As the lake fills, it reaches the point of critical mass, releasing a tsunami of water, mud, and debris. Professor Xu's team has a crucial role to assess the potential for a quake lake collapse. Over 30 quake lakes are under surveillance. Electronic sensors monitor the depth of the rock dam. Any change means the rock is on the move. Stripped of vegetation, the exposed rock is unstable. All it needs is heavy rainfall to create a potentially lethal torrent. The monsoon is less than a month away, but Professor Xu needs to know what could happen now. It could be the difference between life and death. Back at the lab, Professor Xu simulates the likely consequences when loose rock mixes with heavy rain.
After the earthquake, the geological conditions have greatly changed. Therefore, the experiment we're doing now is designed to reflect those changes.
The scientists placed rock and soil samples on an artificial slope, recreating the hillsides around Hongguang. Then they add water. The tests confirm the quake lake could be at risk. Just a few days of heavy rain could put enough pressure on the rock dams to trigger another debris slide. With advanced warning, there's time to evacuate high-risk areas and release pressure on the quake lake before it blows. 17 unstable quake lakes have already been drained. Over 200,000 people safely evacuated, saving Sichuan from further tragedy. Towns like Beichuan and Hongguang will never be rebuilt. Their location near explosive mountains makes them unfit for reconstruction. Engineers like Professor Xu Qiang continue to keep a close eye on the threats of landslides and quake lakes. But they soon discover the biggest potential hazards might not be natural lakes. They could be man-made lakes. High up in the mountains are some of Sichuan's 6,500 dams, generating electricity to feed China's insatiable thirst for power. Zipingpu Dam is less than 5 kilometers from the earthquake's epicenter, a wall of reinforced concrete 156 meters high, designed to hold back over 1 billion cubic meters of water. This dam sits almost directly above a fault line. When the earthquake struck, The ground underneath the dam sank over a meter. A crack crawled 340 meters across the wall. Engineers put the dam on red alert. They're worried the damaged wall could break under pressure with catastrophic consequences. They need to empty the reservoir fast. But as engineers work around the clock to release pressure, focus shifts to a controversial theory. That the trigger of this disaster might not be natural. It could be man-made. Could Zipingpu Dam have set the Sichuan disaster in motion? Man-made quakes are a scientifically proven phenomenon. Seismologist Walter Mooney knows one of the most common causes are large dams.
Dams can cause earthquakes. That's a fact.
The strongest evidence for dam-made quakes comes from the United States. In 1936, Hoover Dam was the world's tallest hydroelectric dam, the world's largest concrete structure, and the first time scientists had solid proof man-made dams could kick off a quake.
The Hoover Dam was built in the 1930s, and it triggered earthquakes, which is something that we now know we should expect.
Scientists discovered dams generate quakes in two ways. When a dam is built on a fault, the weight of millions of tons of water and concrete can create enough force to trigger a tremor. In the second scenario, water from the lake can drain into the fault, lubricating rock and causing the fault to slip. Studies show dam-made quakes usually trigger small, shallow tremors.
Every time we build a large reservoir, some small earthquakes are generated, usually magnitude 2 and 3. So the question then is, what's the relationship between this dam and the magnitude 8 earthquake?
The Sichuan earthquake was bigger and deeper than any documented man-made quake.
From many hundreds of examples that we have, we've never seen a reservoir of this size create an earthquake anywhere near as large.
The evidence suggests the dam did not create the quake, but this case is far from closed. Scientists have only begun to unravel the catastrophic chain of events that demolished Sichuan. To find out whether the earthquake was a freak event or a disaster waiting to happen, a team of geologists is journeying into the heart of the fault. And what they're about to find will rewrite the geological record. The Sichuan earthquake unleashed a cataclysmic chain reaction, powerful enough to destroy over 5 million buildings. And rip open the ground like a zipper for more than 300 kilometers. There's no historical record of a quake this big in Sichuan. But there could be evidence of a violent past hidden deep underground. Sichuan straddles two continental plates, engaged in a mighty and ancient battle. Most earthquakes are created by movements of titanic slabs of the Earth's crust, called tectonic plates. For millions of years, the Indian plate has been slowly grinding north into the Eurasian plate. An impressive clash that created the world's highest mountain chain, the Himalayas. And in Sichuan province, the same forces built the Dragon's Gate Mountains. Today, the Dragon's Gate Mountains are slowly thrusting above the Sichuan plain at a rate of 4 millimeters a year. Before the quake, few people knew about the ticking time bomb right beneath their feet. On the day of the disaster, the historic Bailu Church hosted a wedding party. It was supposed to be the happiest day of Deng Li's life.
I couldn't find my bride. Where was she? I looked around and somebody was shouting, "Earthquake, earthquake."
The church that stood strong near an ancient fault for over a century, reduced to rubble in seconds. The shocking event left everyone stunned and confused. Geologist Professor Li Yong knows few people were prepared for such a massive tremor.
This region's people never experienced such a huge earthquake in their lives. The destruction was massive.
Today, Professor Li heads into the Dragon's Gate Mountains to undertake a disaster autopsy. He hopes to uncover the mechanisms behind the mega quake. The team inspects the quake zone for surface ruptures, places where seismic energy buckled and tore the ground apart. A trail of evidence that could lead them directly to the precise cause of the quake. In the town of Bailu, the fault ruptured through the heart of a school playground.
The upper side of the fault was raised up 2 meters vertically. Lucky both of those buildings survived and no one died.
To Professor Li, this is evidence of a classic thrust fault. When two sides of a fault collide and one side slides under the other, it's called a thrust earthquake. The largest ground movement was 9 meters, making the Sichuan earthquake the largest continental thrust event ever recorded. Despite its magnitude, Professor Li wasn't surprised when the earthquake struck. He's one of the few scientists to predict that the Dragon's Gate Mountains were potentially dangerous.
10 years ago, we found a moving fault over there on the hill. We came here to see if it was active. It was an active fault. And it's the same region where the 2008 quake took place.
The question for Li is whether the Sichuan quake was a one-off event. A similar megaquake could have happened before, but a long time ago. To support his theory, Professor Li digs several meters underground. A technique called paleoseismic trenching. Li's looking for signs of a previous earthquake. Unusual patterns in the soil layers.
Here it clearly shows some essential features of a fault.
An irregular band of blue mudstone reveals evidence he's been looking for. The horizontal layer buckles into a vertical slab of mud, the telltale pattern of a thrust fault quake. And it's almost identical to the Sichuan rupture.
We discovered that the biggest earthquake before the Sichuan earthquake was about 1,000 years ago.
Carbon dating confirms the geological evidence. This was a 1 in 1,000-year event. That's a long time for pressure to be building. And Lee doesn't believe that much seismic energy came from just one fault.
I believe there are 3 ruptures in Dragon's Gate. One is at the back of the mountain, one's in the middle of the mountain, and the third rupture is at the front of the mountain, where we're standing right now.
To prove his theory, Professor Lee needs to identify other active faults in the area. The 3 biggest run parallel, and together stretch over 300 kilometers. The Wenchuan Fault, the Beichuan Fault, and the Pengguan Fault. Li Yong believes these faults are all active. When one goes, the others could topple. Professor Lee needs proof, but it'll take a lifetime to survey these mountains on foot. Lee needs help. Hundreds of kilometers above the Earth, satellites constantly scan the globe, recording the Earth's changing landscapes. Some satellites even record ground movement from earthquakes. INSAR is a satellite-based radar that penetrates cloud and vegetation to record surface changes as small as a few centimeters. Then it transmits the data to research scientists like Dr. Eric Fielding at NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab. Dr. Fielding crunches the data to produce interferograms, images that show precise changes in the Earth's crust.
We take a before image and an after image, which then allows us to estimate which parts of the fault slipped and how much it slipped, which is really important to understand how the earthquake was generated.
The measurements combine to create a detailed picture of fault movements. The information confirms what geologist Li Yong suspected. The Sichuan quake ruptured more than one fault.
If it had just been one fault, maybe it would have been the 6.5 earthquake, but instead a sequence of faults ruptured consecutively, which increased the size and, of course, increased the devastation.
The satellite imaging reveals why the intensity of the Sichuan earthquake was so horrific and shocking. Nearly 20 kilometers underground, seismic energy tears through the Earth at speeds of up to 15,000 kilometers per hour. Multiple faults rupture one after the other, releasing the combined power of a magnitude 7.9 quake. The Sichuan quake is so intense, it puts the whole region at risk from further earthquakes. A seismic side effect called aftershock. Aftershocks are earthquakes triggered when the Earth's crust settles from a megaquake. "24 hours after the Sichuan earthquake, hundreds of aftershocks rocked the Dragon's Gate Mountains, triggering landslides, toppling unstable buildings, and threatening more lives. It could take years for the tremors to stop. Knowing where aftershocks are likely to occur could save lives. Thousands of kilometers away, one scientist is working on a system for forecasting aftershocks in Sichuan. United States Geological Survey seismologist Dr. Tom Parsons studies the patterns of aftershock by observing the way stress changes inside the Earth's crust.
Once a main shock happens, a big one like this, it torques and twists the crust and it changes the stress, and earthquakes respond to stress accumulation in the crust. But there's nothing different about an aftershock or a main shock. They're all just earthquakes responding to stress.
From his studies, Dr. Parsons identifies areas of Sichuan that could be vulnerable to aftershock in the future. He believes there are multiple stress points along the faults in the Dragon's Gate Mountains.
I looked at between 10 and 20 major faults that had the ability to have a magnitude 7 or larger earthquake.
The stress in some of these faults increased after the main quake, and it wouldn't take much to set them off.
It was a surprise to us that it was tiny amounts of stress was enough to trigger an earthquake. About the amount that when you fill up a bicycle tire, that's about how much push seems to be necessary to trigger another earthquake. Which tells us that the crust is sort of teetering on the edge and it doesn't take much of a kick to push it over.
And the high-risk zones? Long faults that run north and south to the Dragon's Gate Mountains. Knowing this helps authorities to decide the safest locations to relocate and rebuild towns devastated by the quake. Dr. Parsons is cautious about calling it a prediction.
This is still experimental work. It would be premature to issue some sort of public warning and say this is a spot where, because we don't know that. We don't know that well enough yet.
But scientists do know earthquakes are inevitable. Today, a network of seismic monitoring stations maintains a vigil on ground movements all over China. Seismologists are on a constant state of alert. Because when China shakes, the lives of millions are at stake. The world's deadliest quakes are China quakes. The top 2 most lethal earthquakes on record rocked China. The massive loss of life raises the question, will we ever be able to predict earthquakes? Most scientists are skeptical of prediction claims.
People want to believe that we can predict earthquakes. We also want to believe that we can cure cancer and solve a lot of other problems. And it's going to take an enormous effort to cure cancer or to ever predict earthquakes.
But science is getting closer to quake prediction with early warning systems. Technology that gives people time to run for cover. Researchers harness seismic P waves to set off alarms before disaster strikes. P waves travel faster than damaging S waves, giving potential victims precious seconds to prepare.
If you have 20 seconds, that gives you enough time to take cover. And if you're on a train, you'll be really happy to have that train stop rather than go off the track as the shaking takes place.
In China, the warning could be enough to evacuate a school. But not an entire city. The message is clear. Even if a system of prediction is developed, people living on a quake zone still need to build stronger buildings.
If we haven't built our buildings strong enough to withstand the event we just predicted, people come back home to rubble.
It took minutes for the earthquake to demolish parts of Sichuan. It'll take years to rebuild. The team of engineers, geologists, and seismologists came to unlock the mysteries of the China Quake to make sure Sichuan never suffers the same fate again.
It kind of looks like they didn't soak the bricks in water before they built the wall.
Dr. Elizabeth Hausler wants to change the way homes are designed and built.
We exist to prevent this sort of thing from happening in the future. So we develop local skills, teaching people how to build earthquake-resistant houses. It's not just a matter of rebuilding, it's rebuilding in a way that's going to prevent this house from collapsing in the next earthquake. Great, Shay, you're good. Thank you.
Professor Xu Qiang identified geologically stable areas in the Dragon's Gate Mountains, places where people can start to rebuild their lives.
It is our duty to reduce the risks of geological disasters to a minimum. We shall return the society to a safe environment.
And Professor Li Yong is updating seismic hazard maps to make sure no one in China builds on a fault ever again.
We need to make people who live in this earthquake zone more aware of the dangerous environment in which they live.
We may or may not ever be able to predict earthquakes, but we can get better at surviving them, thanks to a team of dedicated scientists who ventured into Sichuan and uncovered the truth about China's killer quake.